All right. Hi, everyone. I am Toby. I want to do a very brief lecture today on mastering motion vetoes in 3v3. This is for Australs 2024. Haven't been to Australs in a long, long time, but it's one of my favorite tournaments and was a very, very fun format. Um, at the end of this lecture, I really just want to cover three main things. The first is quick tips on how not to veto, things that every team should avoid that I think are common at every level in the circuit. The second is I want to talk about the concept of strategic vetoes and guiding principles you should keep in mind while you're doing the veto. I think many teams have the intuition of going into the veto gung ho. Most debaters aren't taught systematically or coached about how they should approach motion vetoes and are sort of expected to just get it as they go along the way. And most teams aren't consistent with the ways they want to do vetoes. So while a team might track their performance in round on any given motion, they have a sense of how good or bad their case was. They rarely get feedback on how good or bad their vetoing was. And because of that, it's very difficult to improve and make yourself a better debater in that sense for the format. The third and final thing I want to talk about is prep dynamics. So, how do you overcome conflict, specifically when it comes to the veto, and how do you manage your time and stress? In most tournaments, I think in Australs as well, usually you're given a very, very limited time to do the veto, less than 5 minutes if you consider how much you have to move around, take pictures of info slides, things like that. How do you effectively manage that? How do you get around that without panicking, without devolving into a mess? First things first, how not to veto. Three things on this. The first thing that everyone should note is that arrogance is the enemy. I think the tendency with not just novice debaters, but also very skilled debaters, is to see a motion set of three motions and then immediately think, I've won one of those motions in the past. I have a really great case. It's essentially pre written, and I can just stand there and chat GPT everything I've run before and then win the debate. The problem with this is that there's very little consideration of team dynamics or very little consideration of the nuances that different motions might have. So don't let the bully get their way. Just because someone feels extremely confident about one motion doesn't mean you shouldn't discuss the other motions. The other thing is, if you are in that position, let's say you're the more experienced speaker on a team, maybe speaking with debaters who are younger or less experienced than you shouldn't just force people to agree to disagree on emotion, because even if you have the perfect case, if you're unable to communicate that to your team because there's a concept in the motion that they fundamentally don't understand, then you're not going to have a very good time in round. The other thing is obviously never think a motion is an easy auto win. I'm sure there are many motions that you think are very easy or motions that you feel very comfortable with, but don't give it less of a fair shot of consideration. And the reason for that is you never know who you're going to go up against. You never know who your judges are. There are many parts of debating that are chaotic, unpredictable, and frankly inconsistent. So don't leave these things out in your consideration of how you want to do the veto. The second pitfall that I see a lot of teams falling into is obsessing over the perfect veto. So many teams waste a lot of their time fussing over getting exactly the right motion, and they're struck by this sort of decision paralysis where they get themselves caught up. Maybe one motion is better, maybe another, and they end up not making a choice and end up regretting it the whole way in prep. So while they're prepping for the motion that actually was decided, they have in the back of their mind constantly this thought of, we should have done the other motion. And because of that, they're far less productive and honestly far less engaged in the prep than you should be. So I think partly it's an attitude thing, but also it's a mindset. It's a very real debate strategy thing. Once the veto happens, you can't afford to look back in anger. You can't afford to look back in regret. So don't obsess over getting the veto wrong. Most motions are still debatable. They might not be the best for you, but they're certainly there. There's definitely a case you can make. The third pitfall is my favorite, which I like to call gambling, hope, and self delusion. There are many cases where you, as a speaker, looking at the motion set, know that there is a very strong case for the other side to run. But because you want to do that motion, or because you don't like the other two motions, you pretend that they probably won't run it anyways. And debaters are excellent at coming up with all sorts of mental self-rationalizations to justify why the other team won't run it. Oh, they're novices. Oh, they've never seen this motion before. Oh, they're from X and X background or X and X circuit, which obviously you shouldn't be thinking. And so they probably wouldn't know this argument. Stuff like this. There are many traps that we feed ourselves into because of our tendency for gambling hope and self-delusion. Obviously, try to avoid that. Think the best of your opponents. It's better for your debating and fair to your opponents if you always anticipate that they will run the strongest arguments. So never think that there's an element of, oh, we have the advantage here because we're older, we're more knowledgeable, more experienced, etc. Okay, now I want to get into the heart of this lecture, which is strategic vetoes and some guiding principles. I think the problem with the way many teams do vetoes at 3v3 tournaments, especially teams that come from BB, is they don't start with a clear objective or a clear end in mind, which is they treat the veto as kind of auxiliary to the prep, just a distraction, a way to just decide what motion we're going to end up doing. What I think every team should go into the veto with is the thought that we want the motion that gives us the clearest winning strategy. We want the motion that gives us the clearest winning strategy. Now, that might sound like a no brainer. Like, obviously, you want the motion that gives you the clearest winning strategy. But I find that if you remind yourself of that when the prep time starts, it's about the clarity of our strategy. It's not just about this random technical detail in the case. It's not about this one random obscure piece of matter that one of my teammates has that we might be able to use to flip the round, right? It's about the cohesive case strategy and whether or not you can sell that to the judge. Because it doesn't matter if you know some rare fact about semiconductors, which flips the NVIDIA motion on its head. If nobody in your team gets it and the judge doesn't get it and the strategy is all over the place, then it's probably not the best motion for you to end up on, right? So always think about how clear the winning strategy is and use that as the basis for how you do your vetoes. The first thing I want to talk about is what I think are the three guiding pillars of how you should do your veto. So your strategy, the amount of material you have, so how deep your knowledge base on the case is, and optics. What I mean by optics is whether or not there's a perceptual bias. So there will be times where you are debating the more, I don't want to say intuitive, but perhaps the more value aligned side of emotion. So you might be defending the more perceptually liberal side or the more perceptually conservative side, or the what is generally held to be the right side of the motion. And in those instances, there is a big optics disadvantage because you have to convince the judge of an unintuitive case, right? Maybe you're debating a motion where you have to support some economic policy that on the face of it hurts such and such demographic, hurts some ethnic minority, maybe it hurts women disproportionately, maybe it hurts homeless people, whatever, and you have to find a way to spin it even though perceptually you're on the losing side of the motion, so to speak. The struggle with vetoes is you have to wrap your head around the heart of the debate in such a short amount of time. You're not going to be able to come out with a fully fleshed case in like 30 seconds from seeing the motion. So I think it's better to ask questions as a shortcut. I have 5 listed down here, but I don't think these are like exhaustive. And obviously, as a team, you guys are going to come up with your own. But I want to run through these ones because I think they're quite strong. The first and most important one to me is to ask yourself what the strongest, clearest, and most obvious illustration of the case is for either side. I have an example here that came from round 8 of Australs 2020. Let's just take a look at the first motion, that we prefer a world where social media networking sites are only available on a paid subscription basis. The first question you should immediately be asking is, what is a clear example of a social media site that's available on a paid subscription basis? What are the differences in terms of the user experience? What are the differences in terms of the type of content that's out there? Does it make it better or worse? Or in what ways is it better or worse? On the converse, what's the example of a social media site where it's completely free? What's the revenue model? What's the user experience, right? Like, right? Because 99% of debating comes down to your ability to name real world illustrations and compel the judge on the basis of that. Like, I know we like to pretend that we're all abstract thinkers who are able to come up with all sorts of hypothetical scenarios or instances where the policy should work. But realistically, and in the real world, right, if you can come up with a compelling example of when the motion happened and why it was better one way or the other, then that's a long way and that's a long advantage in terms of convincing the target audience, the audience you want to target, versus having to deal with abstract hypotheticals of what a paid subscription social media site might look like versus a free one. Yeah, sorry, a bit of a rant. The second thing is, have we done a motion like this before? I think debaters have a tendency to over rely on this, where they try to map every new motion to a motion they've seen before, or like a common archetype of emotion. It's not bad, and I think it's definitely useful because it points you to the right arguments, but you should just be aware of how the motions are different. For example, the second motion here, that we should aggressively censor offensive and discriminatory content. I remember at least in 2020, 2021, there were tons and tons of motions about social media censorship. So most teams who came into this Australs came into round eight probably saw a motion like this before. They probably were familiar with the case that came out on it. Um, Third question, what are the pivotal characterizations involved? So what are the things the motion is going to spin on? Um, Most likely another way of phrasing this is to say, in what situations does the motion actually take place? Or what situation should we actually care about? So for instance, that we should ban mergers and acquisitions of mass media companies. There is a pure libertarian abstract case for why mergers of media companies are good, right? You can run the, oh, corporate efficiency, oh, if they're being acquired, there's a greater scale benefits, yada, 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 things you would find in a textbook, right? But you have to ask yourself whether those situations are actually the situations where mergers take place. Is it really cases where company A is acquiring company B because it provides a X% efficiency boost in the way it provides revenue to its user base? Like, realistically, does that ever happen? Is that the most common situation in the debate? It might be, it might not be. It's your job to come up with that and figure out how you'll defend it throughout the round. Um, Fourth question, very quickly, how deep or broad is the argument base available to either side? There are times where you can see the motion right away and realize there are probably only one or two arguments that are good for the other side to run, or one or two arguments that are good for your side to run. That doesn't mean you should automatically veto it, but it does mean that you should sort of be testing in your head already whether those two arguments are strong enough to stand up to scrutiny, such that you would be willing to dive your feet into the motion as a whole. Fifth and final question is there a perceptual bias for one side or the other? This is kind of difficult to gauge because it depends on a lot of things. It depends who your judge is. It depends on the climate of the social climate at the time, how people feel. Like the second motion here for round eight, this was at the time where, there was a lot of talk about Twitter censorship, which isn't around in the news today. So be aware of recent events. Be aware of the articles that your judge might be reading that might skew their perception of the motion one way or the other. Okay, dealing with weighted motion sets. Ad scores are typically cautious and they spend a lot of time testing motion sets. So it's unlikely that you'll find yourself in a scenario where all of the motions are biased against you. What's more likely to happen is there's one motion that clearly favors gov or af, and one motion that clearly favors op or neg. And so both of those motions are going to get instantly vetoed, and you're going to end up on a sort of middle ground motion that you may or may not be happy with. In the case you are in the unfortunate situation where there are two or three weighted motions and you just feel like you can't get around it, there are a few tips here. The first is to start rethinking about how you're using your veto, right? So you don't want to just find the motion with the strongest case for your side. If you think the case is already weak, it's already mid, it's not the best, then shift the way you're thinking about the round and think instead, okay, how can I limit the number or quality of arguments the other side has to run? So there might be an instance where you feel like you're still on the at the disadvantage, but the motion, you're comparing one motion where Gov has like a super technical case, There are so many directions they could take it in, versus another motion where there's really only one or two clear arguments that Gov can run. In that situation, you should always try to pick the narrower motion so you know what to predict, right? If you're already in a tough spot, case wise, then you don't want to give your opponent an easier time by giving you a harder job in terms of responses. The same is true for illustrations, right? So if you're comparing two motions that you think are weighted, maybe pick the side where there's not as clear an illustration for the other side, right? Like if there's a very clear real world example for Gov on motion one, but on motion two, there's no real direct analogy to what the motion is talking about for their side, then maybe that's better. Yep. So find the motion that gives you the most room to narrow the scope of the round. So if you can limit it to a certain demographic, a certain geography, a certain set of situations, or a certain set of companies, a certain set of types of workers, types of people, then that's better, right? Because when things are tough, you don't want to engage on the broadest scale possible where you can lose on so many different fronts, especially in 3v3. I would say the core difference between 3v3 and BP is that in 3v3, you really want to drill down on those 2 to 3 clear paths to victory. Because the more complicated things get, the more likely it is that judges will just default to what the clearest strategic path to victory is and base their decision making around that. It's not as sophisticated as BP, where you're doing inter-house weighing, and so everything sort of gets a more detailed consideration. Okay. The second to the last thing I want to talk about is navigating info slides. There has been a trend at recent majors rather, of info slides getting longer and longer. We could discuss all day why this is happening. My personal thoughts are it's getting harder and harder for course to come up with new interesting debate topics that don't require at least some prerequisite material. And so there's been more of a need to sort of give an introductory reading to what the debate is about so that people get it right. Um, I don't think longer info slides are going to go away. I think it's just a function of the fact that debating is evolving. It's been around for so long, so we're going to have to deal with it. There are a few tips I want to give in relation to that. The first thing is you should know that longer info slides mean it's also harder for the judge to wrap around the starting point for the debate to happen. So you should, one, be preparing for a muddier round, and two, be thinking of illustrations right away. If you can chop up the info, if you can boil down the info slide to one or two clear examples of the situation the motion is talking about, that does such a massive does such a massive boon to your judge, a massive help to your judge, because it gives them the mental shortcut of not having to think about all of the working parts in the info slide and just think, oh, okay, this is what happened in this conflict where the motion applies. This is what happened in this case where the motion applies. I can use that as a basis for how I want to judge the round. The second tip here is make sure you give everyone time to read the info slides. In general, I've worked with teams that don't like quiet time at the start. I've worked with teams that do like quiet time at the start. I'm partial to giving everyone like 30 seconds to a minute at the start of motion release to just read everything and digest everything and then start talking about it. So don't start yapping as soon as the motions come out because it's probably not productive. Um, the third and final thing is don't fixate on every detail of the info slide. In 99% of rounds, the key concept or actor or scenario is probably going to evolve with the debate. So you want to focus on your winning strategy. It's very annoying, both as a debater and a judge, where at third speaker or reply, people are still referring back to like sentence 4 in the info slide because it changes this fact about the debate, right? If you can't come up with a charitable middle ground for teams to agree, it's probably not a very good debate in the first place, right? So again, in 3v3, your job is to clarify. Your job is to clarify. It's not to muddy the debate and win on minor technical mechanistic weighing, right? You want to have the clearest strategy, the clearest path to victory. Have like a few solid impacts that win you the round and make sure the judge knows that those are your impacts and how you get to them. Final thing is on prep dynamics. There are two things I want to talk about. The first is navigating conflict. The second is time and stress management. On navigating conflict. There are three tips I have here. The first is to have a designated speaking order in prep. So person A speaks first, then person B, then person C. It can be in a cycle, and then you can have systems for how you want to interrupt each other. But what you never want to have in prep is you never want to have someone feel like they're being spoken over or someone feel like they're being ignored. This is especially true at the veto, right? Because the tendency, especially in more novice teams, is one person will get excited, they'll start talking, and then the other two aren't really able to contribute. And then you do the veto, and turns out one person doesn't understand the motion you're talking about, right? So you want to make everyone feel involved, and you want to make it systematic, sort of like a boardroom meeting where everyone gets to have a say before any decisions are made. The second tip is make sure you have a clear dispute resolution system. It doesn't have to be perfect. What's important is you're consistent and you treat it like law. So a good one is if we take more than 3 minutes to do the veto, let's just do a vote. Or if we do more than 3 minutes to do the veto, let's just have person A, the most experienced, oldest debater, decide what motions we're going to veto. You can change it, you can tweak it throughout the tournament, but the most important thing is that you have a system in place and you don't blame anyone for using the system. Um, which feeds into the third and final tip, which is don't hold grudges. Things aren't going to go perfectly. Many things are going to go wrong. But once a decision is made, especially with the veto, if you don't get the motion you wanted, it's fine. Keep going, work with it. Most motions are still debatable. Once the veto happens, pretend that the two other motions didn't exist and just go straight into prepping that new motion. There are so many teams that have been destroyed by regret, by doing the veto and then having to go back and kind of like being angsty and passive aggressive with their teammates because they didn't get the motion they wanted. None of that is productive. Focus on the task ahead. Last thing for this session is time and stress management. You will be pressured to do the veto very quickly. Obviously, try to know where the rooms are well in advance. Have a sign so other teams can find you. I think most tournaments use team codes that have emojis. So if you want to draw the emoji or like spell out in big bold letters the emoji, that does such a big help. I know people think these things are irrelevant. They're like cute tricks, but it's such a big logistics help if you can do that and just raise a sign and you can find each other really quickly. Um, the other thing that might be useful is try to stand in just one place, like pick a spot in the prep hall where you are going to stand and wait so that people can see you right away and people know where to look for you consistently, right? Don't try to walk around a lot, at least at the start. Try to establish yourself so that it's easier to find you. These are just like small logistical things. Um, the third and final thing is practice doing vetoes. Practice doing vetoes. A lot of teams practice. They're obviously spars doing rounds, but a lot of teams practice case building. But very few teams practice consciously doing the veto and then evaluating after whether or not they got the right motion. I think this is one of the debate trainings that you can do relatively painlessly, right? Just get your team and then find another team and then pull up all of the motion sets you want and then think about how you would do the veto. Do the veto really quickly. And then go straight to feedback. Don't prep the motion. Just do the veto and then see how things work out and then evaluate yourself on that. Give yourself feedback on this one part of debating, right? Like you have to break it down into realistic skills that you can train rather than doing everything all at once. The other thing that's very helpful is, although I know this might not be accessible to everyone, is try to give 1 to 2 sentence summaries of the case you would run on each motion. When you have less than 5 minutes to do a veto, it's very important to be able to summarize your thoughts rather than ramble. So, for instance, if you're sharing with your team, you might say something like, I think we should do motion B. I don't like motion A because I think op has these two very strong arguments, argument one, argument two. At the same time, I don't like motion C because I think op has this one characterization that's disadvantageous to us. So being able to structure and summarize your thoughts very quickly will speed up the process of doing vetoes and make everything less painful for you. That's about as much time as I have. Thanks everyone. Good luck at Australs. Hope you have a great time.